Fairmont crest, people had grown far too accustomed to perfect faces, elegant dinners,
polished handshakes, and promises so carefully crafted they made it seem as though everyone lived within an unshakable order. But the truth was never on the surface. It always lived in locked pockets of darkness, in names no one dared mention again, in incidents erased from the record as if they had never existed. And Palams King was exactly that kind of name, an old fracture covered over with cement far too quickly, a buried gap everyone thought had been sealed but that was still bleeding beneath their feet. When Bill began to suspect Joey more than ever, he did not merely brush up against a personal secret. He had accidentally touched the center of a web of lies nourished by fear, twisted loyalty, and blood debts no one dared settle. What made everything more terrifying was not what Joey had hidden, but who he had hidden, Laya, a woman who carried herself like a powerful doctor, cold, precise, and almost impossible to shake. Yet the more closely anyone looked, the more they saw that what lived inside her was not the steadiness of a healer, but the rigid control of someone long accustomed to surviving on the edge between saving lives and burying the truth. Joey had never told anyone that Laya was his biological sister, and that silence was the first thing that made this story something far more complicated than a family secret. Because if it had been nothing more than an ordinary blood tie, there would have been no reason for Joey to hide it so completely. No reason for something inside him to turn tense and volatile every time Laya's name surfaced, as though he was not only afraid others would learn who she was, but afraid of what she herself might do if the curtain was torn back. Joey was the kind of man who liked to stand in control, who liked to arrange every piece, who liked to believe he was always one step ahead of everyone else. And yet with Laya, that feeling had never been complete. She was part of his past, a part he wanted to keep close enough to remind himself where he came from, but also wanted to conceal because he understood too well the darkness that past carried. No one knew that behind those many years of silence was a childhood built not on affection, but on running, on changing names, on nights spent learning not to trust anyone. Joey and Laya had not grown up inside a family. They had grown up inside a survival mechanism. They had not been taught how to love each other like ordinary siblings. They had been taught how to protect each other through lies, through emotional amputation, through turning every wound into a secret that could never be allowed to bleed in front of strangers. Bill was not the type of man who could easily accept being guided by half-truths. At first, his suspicions about Joey came only in scattered fragments of discomfort. Instincts that kept returning whenever Joey seemed far too calm in the face of questions that should have made him lose control. The calmer Joey became, the more convinced Bill was that behind that composure stood a well-practiced machinery of concealment. But Bill was not prepared for the moment everything shifted from suspicion to shock. The truth that Laya was Joey's sister did not come to him like some harmless, accidental discovery. It arrived as if someone had placed a piece directly in front of him at the perfect moment, enough to ensure he could not turn away, enough to pull him deeper into the maze. A forgotten file surfacing at exactly the right time, an old name appearing in hospital records, a connection through birth dates. A registration form that had once been altered but never completely erased. Bill was smart enough to understand that major secrets did not simply fall at one's feet. If he had learned this, then someone had likely wanted him to know, and that was the most frightening part. Because a truth revealed on purpose was never a gift. It was always bait. Laya appeared precisely when Bill began digging deeper into Joey, and that timing was far too perfect to be random. She arrived like a blade polished, so clean it reflected the light, sharp, elegant, flawless. In the hospital, she was order, discipline, power enforced without ever needing to raise her voice. She inspired fear in others with nothing more than a cold glance and the unsettling sense that she knew far more than any doctor should. But the more present she became, the more she gave off the feeling of someone who did not truly belong in a place devoted to healing. She watched too much, reacted too quickly to details connected to old files, became to alert whenever anyone mentioned sealed medical records, surgeries that had vanished from the system, deaths recorded in ways that were suspiciously clean. Gradually, Bill realized that what made Lia dangerous was not only her professional authority, but her ability to move between layers of truth as though she had lived with two identities for so long that she no longer needed to distinguish which face was real. Palams King had long been treated as the kind of case everyone silently agreed should be forgotten. The name carried the smell of dirty money, shadow deals, quiet purges, and people disappearing from the surface of life as though they had never existed. In the public eye, it was nothing more than a tangle of old rumors, a few severed networks, a few statements lacking evidence, a few corrupted files that eventually faded into silence. But to those who had stood anywhere near the center of the storm, Palams King had never been just a case. It was a structure, a mechanism, a tunnel connecting people who appeared and related through money, debt, blood, and enforced silence. The most frightening question was not whether Lia was connected to Palams King, but how. Was she the one holding the key, or was she the lock itself, designed to keep others from going deeper? At times, Bill believed Lia was the keeper of the last pieces of evidence strong enough to drag the entire system into the light. Yet at other times, watching the cold efficiency with which she cut off every attempt to reach her, he saw in her the calm of someone who had lived at the center of darkness for so long she no longer felt revulsion. Joey stood in the middle of it all under the most violent strain of anyone. If he had known all along that Lia was living with two identities, then every rare gesture of tenderness he had shown her became suspect. Perhaps it was not familial love at all, but a pact of silence disguised as blood. Perhaps Joey protected Lia not because she was his sister, but because if she fell, he would be dragged down with her. But if Joey had only recently discovered Lia's true face, then his tragedy was even more bitter. In that case, the person he had believed was the last remaining thread connecting him to his old life had never truly stood on the same side as him. Joey may have built his entire identity out of suspicion, yet the closest person to him was the one who made every calculation collapse. His anger, then, did not erupt in noise, it smoldered. It suffocated, it ate away at reason. He began to read every shift around him through the eyes of a man under siege. Every meeting, every leak, every glance from Lia could be a sign of betrayal. And in that state, Joey became more dangerous than ever, because a man who no longer knows whether he is protecting his family or merely saving himself is always capable of the cruelest act. Vanessa was dragged into the vortex without any preparation. Her feelings for Joey had always been a difficult choice, burdened with outside resistance and her own inner unease. She wanted to believe that beneath Joey's coldness there was still a wounded human being, that love could open an escape where others saw only danger. But once Bill moved closer to the truth and began tracing Lia, Vanessa could no longer afford to live by romantic instinct alone. She was forced to confront the most brutal question of all. Was the man she was protecting a victim of his past, or the one recreating that same darkness in a subtler form? Bill came to her not only as a warning voice, but as someone trying to pull her back from the edge. The problem was that in Vanessa's world, even a warning could be another form of manipulation. The more she listened to Bill, the more divided she felt. One half of her wanted to believe what was coming into view, while the other half recoiled at how quickly the world was willing to call Joey a monster without ever truly facing what had made him. That inner split blinded her for a few more steps, and a few blind steps in a war like this were enough to make her a target. Bill, meanwhile, was not only chasing the truth, he was battling his own obsession. The deeper he went, the more he understood that he may have stepped into a game in which the truth did not exist as a solid whole. Every discovery carried a price. Every answer opened 3 more questions. Sometimes Bill thought he was closing in on unmasking Joey. Sometimes he caught sight of another invisible hand redirecting the entire hunt, forcing him into conflict with Joey at exactly the moment someone needed those 2 men to destroy each other. What made Bill harsher was the feeling of being insulted. He hated the possibility that he might only be a chess piece. He hated the thought that someone understood his mind well enough to know that all it would take was throwing a half-hidden secret in his path, and he would never stop chasing it. That anger made him move faster, harder, and more recklessly. He no longer wanted only to know what Joey was hiding. He wanted to crush the entire mechanism that had dared to turn him into a puppet. But in that fury, Bill began to make mistakes. He applied pressure to early reveal the direction of his investigation, and let the power behind it all realize that he had caught the scent of Palams King. From that moment on, it was no longer a matter of Bill hunting the secret. The secret began hunting him. Leia was the hardest figure to read, and that was exactly what made her the epicenter of the tragedy. If she truly was the mastermind, then all the contradictory signals, the moments of hesitation, the fleeting instances when she seemed unwilling to let Joey be dragged all the way down, would have been nothing more than the cold performance of someone highly skilled at manipulating emotions. But if Leia was only a pawn, then her tragedy was even crueler than anyone imagined. In that case, the perfect exterior of a powerful doctor was not a symbol of strength, but armor stitched together from fear. Every hard decision, every sharp glance, every step so precise it bordered on inhumanity was the result of years spent being forced to live under the discipline of an organization that never permitted weakness. Slowly, people began to notice fractures in Leia. She did not react to Bill the way she would react to someone merely interfering in her work. She reacted like someone who knew exactly what he was touching, and knew just how catastrophic the consequences of touching it could be. There were very brief, very rare moments when she looked at Joey and her eyes held not the coldness of someone in control, but a terror compressed until it had turned pale. It was the gaze of a woman who understood that her brother might be the last thing left she still wanted to save, even if she herself was beyond saving. Whoever stood behind all of this, if such a force truly existed as Bill had begun to believe, understood better than anyone how to weaponize the siblings' wounded past. No chains were needed. All it had to do was keep a few files, a few living witnesses, a few pieces of evidence powerful enough to destroy any life they tried to rebuild. It used their family secret as a silencing device. It forced Joey into silence with the threat that Leia would collapse. It forced Leia to continue playing her role with the threat that Joey would be erased. In a structure like that, family was no longer a refuge. It had been turned into a delayed explosive. The more they loved each other, the easier they were to control. The more they tried to protect each other, the more they became servants to the very thing that had ruined them both from the beginning. And that was perhaps why Joey had never spoken the truth. Not because he was ashamed of Leia, not only because he wanted to hide a dangerous lie. More deeply than that, he understood that the moment Leia's name came into the light in its full reality, the machine that had trapped them for years would tighten instantly. His silence was not just concealment. It was an attempt to postpone the apocalypse. But the apocalypse came anyway. Bill, through sheer stubbornness and pride, pushed everything to the point of no return. Vanessa, through love and hesitation, became a weakness both sides could exploit. Joey, trapped between the fear of losing his sister and the fear of betrayal, began making harsher and shorter-sighted decisions, like a wounded beast biting at everything around it. And Leia was finally pushed to the edge of a choice. Saving her brother meant betraying the organization that had controlled her life for too long, accepting that every piece of evidence, every false identity, every hidden ear would explode at once. Remaining loyal to that organization, however, meant sacrificing Joey, handing her brother over to the same machinery of purging that she understood better than anyone. There was no clean choice left. There was no road afterward on which any of them could continue living as ordinary people. As the truth began to surface in fragments, the greatest shock was not whether Leia was the mastermind. The real shock was that Palams King had never been just an isolated case. It was the first door into a far greater conspiracy, A network rooted in places once thought safest, from hospitals to legal institutions to the most intimate relationships in Fairmont Crest. The deaths once dismissed as separate, the disappearances once filed away, the people who had changed names, changed lives, even changed the way they spoke just to survive, turned out to be only the visible consequences of a structure that had been operating in silence for years. And within that structure, Joey and Leia were not entirely innocent, but neither were they fully the monsters the world wanted to call them. They were twisted products of a system that had stolen their youth, their identities, and their ability to trust, then thrown them a handful of cruel choices and forced them to condemn one another with them. In the end, the deepest pain was not about who won this war. The deepest pain was that once everything was exposed, no one could keep the old version of themselves. Bill came to understand that truth did not set people free in the beautiful way he once believed. It destroyed before it redeemed. Vanessa understood that loving someone swallowed by darkness did not make the darkness disappear. Sometimes it only pulled you farther in. Joey understood that protecting family through silence for too long was, in the end, still a form of betrayal. And Leia understood that living with two identities for too long did not only make others unable to know who you were, but eventually made even you unable to tell where the real self ended and where the mask built for survival began. And when the true storm finally tore through Fairmont Crest, what remained would not be a secret newly solved, but the wreckage of people who once believed they could bury the past deeply enough that it would never return. But the past does not die. It only lies still, waiting for the right person, the right moment, the right fracture through which to rise again and drag everything down with it.